Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Berman Institute seminar series. We're just going to give folks another 40 seconds or so to file in as Zoom catches up with everyone joining the webinar. But we'll start in just a few seconds. All right, well, I think we'll give it a go. I see we're reaching about 20 attendees, and I'm sure a few others will join, but just I wanted to welcome everyone again to our bi-weekly Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. Our Jeff Kahn, who usually introduces the series, is not able to join today, so I'm just doing a quick intro on his behalf and on behalf of the Berman Institute, just to welcome everyone on board. And I'm going to hand off now to Jess Fonzo, who's going to introduce our speaker today. Jess, over to you. Thanks.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Jess Fonzo. I am part of the Berman Institute of Bioethics, a professor at Johns Hopkins. I work on food policy and ethics. And it's really great to have our guest speaker today, Jack Bobo. Jack is the CEO of Futurity, a food foresight company that advises companies, foundations, governments, multilaterals on emerging food trends and consumer attitudes and behaviors related to the future of food, a very timely and important topic. He previously served as the Chief Communications Officer and Senior Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs at Intrexon Corporation. And prior to that, he worked at the US Department of State for 13 years as a senior advisor for global food policy, food security, climate change, biotechnology, and agriculture trade. So he's well positioned to talk about all things food and the future of food. Jack received his JD from Indiana University, as well as his Master of Science in Environmental Sciences, a bachelor's in science and biology, and a BA in psychology and chemistry. He's considered a global thought leader. He's delivered many speeches. This will be, what, 501, Jack, in many countries. And he's been recognized by Scientific American as one of the most influential people in biotechnology. And he's going to hopefully answer the question today: can agriculture save the planet before it destroys it? Thanks so much for joining us, Jack. Over to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I know we have some millennials in the room, so the answer is yes. The question is, will it? And so you got to stick around a little bit longer to see whether or not it will. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. I was supposed to be talking to a group last year, but there were a lot of intervening factors. And so here it is a year later. So it's great to be here with you. I am going to bring up my slides here real quick. And let's see. Great. Hopefully that's up so that everybody can see it.
Looks great. Yeah.
So the question is, can agriculture save the planet before it destroys it? Now, as was mentioned, my background is with the US Department of State. Spent 13 years doing global food policy, but I really had my agriculture background start in southern Indiana. And we didn't have a farm, but we were surrounded by farmland. The cornfields came up to my backyard, but we did have a family garden, and we grew corn and peppers and green beans and cantaloupes and watermelons, and my mother canned everything. And so I tell people that, we were basically smallholder farmers. We were subsistence farmers. We ate pretty much, we produced almost everything we ate, and we were all organic because we had child labor, which was me and my brothers. So it was an interesting life. I didn't think of it as agriculture until many, many years later, because I knew what real farming was. But it really gave me an appreciation for the challenges of producing one's own food. Now, the question about agriculture, though, in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, and yet there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge that we all have is how to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce the negatives. And so I just want to put some of those negatives into perspective. So let's see if this will start advancing. Great. So if we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's nothing more important than agriculture. And I think we would all agree that the footprint is as big, if not bigger, than we'd like it to be. So nothing bigger than ag and land. If we were to talk about water, this is the Aral Sea back in 1973. And if we fast forward to today, you can see that it's no longer really a sea at all. And that's largely because of agricultural withdrawals of water. 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. Now, these aren't just problems in other places. The Colorado River, the 5th longest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these are not the challenges of 2050. These are the realities of today. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture, but another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. Now that's almost as much as energy, and it's more than anything else. And yet most of what we hear is about energy policy, really not that much about agriculture policy. And yet for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you actually get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now those are critical long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world, positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food in order to get a cleaner environment? From what I know of most Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that because I don't work for the government anymore. So how do we get people to understand and appreciate the opportunity that agriculture presents? Now, you probably know we're going from 7.8 billion people on the planet to 9.5, maybe even 10 billion by 2050. So that's a huge challenge in and of itself. But we also have 700 million people who will go to bed hungry tonight. And we also have about 9 million people who die every year of hunger. Now that's more than HIV and road accidents, and malaria. You add all of these other things up that make headlines, and it's still less than agriculture and less than hunger. So it's very hard though for people to wrap their minds around 9 million people dying of hunger. So let's again try to put it in perspective. That's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. Many of those are children. Now, there's nobody who wouldn't go and help that child if they saw that child that was hungry. And yet, so many of these people, we don't even know that they are hungry. So there's nothing that we're able to see and do about it. So how do we get people to recognize that each one of those 9 million people is an individual that we should care about? That's part of the challenge. Now, as I mentioned, 700 million people going to bed hungry. Now, I often hear about our food system being broken. And when you hear that 700 million people are going to bed hungry, it's easy to believe that that's a broken food system. But it's also totally unacceptable in this day and age. But if our food system is broken today, when was it not broken? When was it better than it is today? And so that's part of the question is, are things bad and getting worse, or are they good and getting better? Because how we frame the conversation is really critically important, because that determines who's part of the solution and who's part of the problem. So if we were to look at hunger, as I said, less than 10% of the people on the planet go to bed hungry today. But 50 years ago, 1/3 of all the people on the planet went to bed hungry. Just 30 years ago, about 24%. So we've gone from 1/3 to 24 to less than 10%. Now there have been some recent increases in the number of people that are hungry, and that's again a problem. But the overall direction is to dramatically reduce the number of people that are going to bed hungry. And again, this is important because if the problem is the broken food system and the people who are producing food are failing us, then they're the problem. They're the ones who need to be solved. But if things are getting better, they're the solution to the problem. We need to help them instead of them needing our help. Another way of looking at it would be at child mortality. Again, over the last couple hundred years, child mortality has dramatically been reduced. And this is one of the reasons why many people, many women are having fewer children. It's because childhood mortality has declined so much. It drives changes. Now, we often hear about the deforestation and it's caused by expanding agriculture. And of course, that's true. Many of the forests are being replaced by livestock production or soybean production or other things. But if we were farming today the way we were in 1960, things would be dramatically different. In fact, we are using somewhat more land, but we're producing dramatically more food. Now, today, there are about 3.6 billion hectares of forest on the planet. If we were farming the way we were in 1960, we would have had to cut down 1 billion of those hectares to produce the food we have. So that's what's not seen. We don't recognize that 1 billion hectares of forest exist solely because of improvements in agriculture. What we see are the forests that are cut down to expand agriculture. So again, is the agriculture the problem or the solution? Well, it's both. And so how do we get people to understand when it's good and when there's a problem that needs to be fixed? Now, you may have heard from the Food and Agriculture Organization, we need between 60 and 100% more food by 2050, but we need to be doing it using less land, less water, and fewer resources. So again, everything better tomorrow than we're doing it today. Now, another way to think about the changes that have occurred is to look at the improvements in a particular crop. So what's the difference between producing a bushel of corn today and back in 1980? Well, we use 35% fewer greenhouse gases to produce that bushel. There's 40% less land needed to produce it. There's 40% less energy, 50% less water, and there's 60% less erosion. Now, we could do the same assessment for canola and soybeans and cotton and other crops, wheat, and we'd find exactly the same thing. Farmers today are wildly more productive than they were. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't eutrophication of waterways and deforestation and all of the problems. They all do exist, but things are still dramatically better in terms of how we're producing that food. It's not so much about right and wrong and good and bad. It's more about choices and consequences. So if you look at Europe, Europe will increase its agricultural production by just under 4% over the next decade or so. And that's just ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, Brazil will increase its production by about 40%, driven by demand in its number one and number two export markets, Europe and China. So Europe needs more food, but it just isn't going to produce the food. And because it doesn't produce the food, somebody else will. So the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. Europe, in fact, imports 70% of its animal feed needs. So Europe is often considered a model for how food should be produced, and yet it isn't feeding itself. In fact, it has exported its agricultural footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. The amount of land needed to produce soybeans for Europe is about the same as the agricultural land of Germany. So imagine that. There's an entire Germany in Brazil feeding Europe. And so again, understanding choices and consequences. Europe can afford to not produce that food because it can buy it someplace else. The question is, will it be produced in a more sustainable way in that other place? Choices and consequences. Now, what I often deal with are these competing worldviews of how our food should be produced. On one hand, there's a slow food movement that says we should produce our food the way it was produced 100 years ago. And on the other hand, there's this fast food, high-tech, intensive, that we need to be producing more with less. And it's a very intensive view of what our food system should look like. And in many ways, these two are moving in opposite directions. Yet we need to bring them together in order to get the best of both. How do we keep them from being competing worldviews and being part of a continuum of a worldview? Now, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends and family. And if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. How do we get people to recognize these changes in our food systems as innovations that they might enjoy and love, as opposed to change that they're concerned about? Now, we often run into the question of how food is marketed. And one of the problems we have is that when consumers have a false belief, it's often in the interest of the food company to cater to the belief than to try to eradicate it. So what does that mean? Well, that's how you end up with a bottle of water. And if you were to look closely at the cover there, it would say 0 preservatives, vegan, gluten-free, non-GMO, all natural. And so you can imagine the conversation that happened between the marketing guy and the food scientist. And the marketing guy's like, how can we get people to buy more of our water? And he's like, if we only had gluten-free water, we would be great. And the scientist is like, well, our water is gluten-free. And he's like, what? We could own the gluten-free water market. And they're putting things on there because consumers say they care about them. But the consumer doesn't realize that all water is non-GMO or all water is vegan. And so while you're giving the consumer what they want, you're not really giving them what they need, which is they're asking for something because they think that it's going to make their family safer. And if they find out later that your product is no different than any other product, it's just $1 or $2 more expensive, they may feel cheated. They may feel misled. And that undermines confidence in our entire food system. So we need to think about not just what are consumers asking for, but what do they really want? And what do they really need? And are the products that are being provided actually meeting those needs? Now, the consumer's relationship to food has changed a lot over the last 50 or 60 years. I like to describe the 1950s and 1960s as the age of progress. And when people during that time thought about what does the future of food look like, it probably looked a little bit like this. People were getting their TV dinner and they're bringing it in, sitting it in front of the actual television and eating it. And it was more processed than the food that had come before. And that was great. People were excited. It was saving time. It was convenient and they enjoyed it. So they liked that science in their food in a way that they're less comfortable with today. Now, if you go to the 1980s and the 90s, it was sort of the age of aspiration. It's when consumers in America were introduced to the choices that were available. And so if you went to 1980 and you went into the grocery store to buy some tomato sauce, you could buy ragu and prego or prego and ragu, and that was it. There just were no choices for your pasta sauce. But by the end of the 1980s, you had chunky, you had spicy, you had dozens of varieties of tomato sauce. And it was the same thing for mustards. It was the same thing for salad dressings and barbecue sauce. Americans were introduced to choice. And those choices they made said something to others about who they were and what their aspirations were. We wanted our choices to demonstrate where we were going in life. Now, if you fast forward to today, it's more of the age of conspicuous production. Now, it's not conspicuous consumption. That's the idea that we buy things to impress other people. But conspicuous production is about knowing more than just the cost of something, but knowing the story behind it. Where did it come from? And here's an example of a kind of coffee that comes from Indonesia. And they take the coffee beans and they feed them to the civet cat and it eats them. And then they come out the other end and somebody hopefully washes them off, grinds it up and sells the coffee for some exorbitant price. It's a great story. And so people will pay more for the story. People want to know the provenance of the foods they eat. And more than that, they want their purchases to be an extension of their values. And that could be related to environmental sustainability or social justice or animal welfare. People today want their food purchases to demonstrate what they care about. And so our relationship to food has changed over time. Now, I like to say that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And that's a challenge because if you care passionately about something, then you want to do something about it. But we're so far removed from food production today that people may not entirely understand or appreciate the implications of the choices or that they're asking for. And so it's important that the consumers have a better understanding, because if you're going to be demanding change, you want to ensure that the change that you get is in fact the change that you want. So how do we ensure that consumers are able to advocate for things that actually help them to achieve the goals they care about? Now, part of this has to do with how food is marketed. And today food is marketed with these beautiful farms, and the animals are happy as they're led to slaughter. And I'm not sure that the animals really care, but this is dog food. And if we're presenting this image of on the packages, it gives a sense of what the farms might look like. But of course, we know they don't look like this at all. And the food companies are presenting an image of the agricultural system that's inconsistent with the agricultural system. And then they get upset with consumers for not understanding how food is produced. Well, if you don't tell people how it's produced, don't be surprised if they don't understand it. And this mismatch or disconnect is leading to skeptical consumers. People are becoming more and more worried about how their food is produced. So when I was in the government, I spent a lot of my time talking about hazard and risk. And for a regulator, they think of it like this: hazard times exposure equals risk. And it's a combination of the hazard and exposure that really tells us something about risk. And so I try to explain the difference. And I might use the analogy that a shark in the water, that's a hazard. When you go swimming in the water, there's exposure, and that becomes a risk that you might want to be concerned about. The problem is that we are hardwired to understand hazards, and we are not hardwired to understand risk unless we're a statistician. And most people don't talk to statisticians, at least not voluntarily. So how do we get people to better understand this? Well, eventually I realized that it just wasn't working. If somebody says that a food can cause cancer, that's the same as saying it does cause cancer. You can't unring that bell. It doesn't matter that in real world situations, it never causes cancer. The fact that it can, in the mind of the consumer, is the same as it does. So I realized that what I was really dealing with was hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And that's really what we're talking about much of the time when people are talking about risk, is really risk perception. And somebody can tweet that something causes a problem, and it can go around the world quickly. This is what I call the tweetification of risk. Information can move so quickly that it's often hard for companies, for governments, for universities, for others to be able to respond in the time frame that's relevant to what's happening. When I was in the government, there would always be the question of when should the government get involved? For example, during flu season, when the risk is high and the media attention is low, governments knew that they needed to encourage people to go out and get their flu vaccine. On the other hand, what happens when the risk is low, but media attention is high? Well, for many in the government, that's not a real risk. But if consumers think it's a risk and they ask for policy changes because they believe it's a risk, I guarantee you it becomes a real risk. So organizations need to be able to, one, track these issues early and engage as well. In terms of what to communicate, well, when I was in the government, we'd often talk about research shows it's safe, or we're trying to feed the world. But research also shows that these are the kinds of things that actually turn people off. Most people are not really worried about feeding the world. And when you tell somebody that research shows it's safe, they really think unsafe. So what I realized was that science, at the beginning of the conversation, only polarizes the audience. If you lead with science, you will lose with science. Those who agree with you more, but those who disagree actually disagree more when you talk about science. Now, I'm sure that's frustrating for those of you who love science, and I'm one of them, but we need to find ways of building trust before we can talk about that science. Just a couple of additional examples. of what people worry about. There are all sorts of things that people are worried about, whether it's terrorist attacks or gun crime or other things, but then there are the things they should worry about. And there's very little correlation between what people worry about and what they should worry about. What they worry about is what they hear about on TV and see on the news. People worry about things that they hear about. How could it be any different? Same thing with where we donate our money. If you look at the causes like breast cancer that raise the most money, and then you compare that to the things that kill us, there's very little correlation between the deaths and where we donate. Of course, what happens is if somebody comes to your door, they knock and they ask for a donation, perhaps you give. But if nobody knocks, if nobody comes, how do you know? We worry about the things we're told to worry about. How could it be any different? We don't worry about things we don't know about. How could it be any different? Now, when it comes to food, part of the goal is to try to make food less scary. And so how do we communicate about food in a way that doesn't turn people off, but maybe interest them more? So I want to give you just a couple examples. Now, I want you to think about the answer to this question. How many of you have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? Now, I can't see your faces, but you could raise your hand anyway. And of those who have not eaten, and I'm guessing that's most who said they haven't eaten it, how many people would love to try it? How many people would love it? And so again, there are probably a few people who haven't tried it, but would love to try it. And of course, the Chinese gooseberry is a kiwi fruit. And so my guess is that many of you have actually eaten a kiwi fruit, but words matter. When it's a kiwi fruit, it's cute and fuzzy, but when it's a Chinese gooseberry, it's a hairy fruit. How we talk about things matters. The story behind them matters. In 1910, some intrepid Kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, brought it back to New Zealand, and created a new variety, but most importantly, rebranded it. And the rest is history. How we talk about things matters. So the language that we use is critical. You may have heard this idea that if you can't pronounce the ingredients in a food, you should not put it in your mouth. Now, for the scientists in the room, that probably drives you crazy. You know that that's not a good explanation. Something can be natural and deadly, and it can be man-made and safe. No way of knowing. But instead of trying to beat people up with science, what you can do is just show them this image that shows that all food is made of chemicals. And most of us can't pronounce the names of any of these chemicals. And many people will see that and they'll laugh and they'll get the fact that maybe their original idea wasn't correct. It's the difference between beating people up with science and leading them to knowledge. People love to learn things. They don't like to be told things. People spend a crazy amount of time watching TED Talks about subjects that they really don't have much interest in, but because it's presented in an engaging way. If you can present information in a way that pulls people in, they will listen. But beating them up with science never works. Now, one thing I want you to leave you with is the idea that we should not trust our brains. Our brains are lying to us all the time. A lot of this comes from the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and their book, in the book for Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. We have two parts to our brain. One part of our brain gets us through our day and makes the quick decisions. And the other part, the slow thinking part, sort of does the heavy lifting, the deep thinking. And the problem is that we don't always know which part of our brain we should be applying any particular problem to, or to any particular problem. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So the first here is, it's a visual illusion. Now I want you to look at it and I want you to think in your mind, which square is darker, square A or square B? Now, I'm hoping that pretty much everybody is looking at this and thinking, well, it's obvious that square A is darker. But of course, I said it's a visual illusion. So when we bring that rectangle down and we cover the space between, what you all of a sudden realize, of course, is that it is exactly the same shade of gray. They're exactly the same, but you can't see them that way. And again, I tell you this because it's an example of our brain is misleading us. It thinks one is in shadow and it thinks that the other one is not. And so it's color correcting for us. But of course, it's actually misleading us. And so our brain tries to help, but sometimes it doesn't. So I want to give you a different example. This one's a math problem called the bat and the ball problem. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's a simple math problem. Any fifth grader can get it right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. Don't worry, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. So here we go. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer. Now, I'm guessing that many of you said 10 cents, or at least that was the first thing you thought. So let's do it again. If the ball cost 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, well, then the bat would cost $1.10. 110 plus 10 is 120. That's not our answer. So the ball must cost 5 cents. The bat cost $1 more. That's $1.05. Together, that's 110. That's our answer. Now, we can all do the math. The problem is that the obvious answer of 10 cents is the one that most easily comes to mind. And if we hadn't stopped to do the math, we could have left this thinking, wow, that was a super easy problem. I'm not sure what he was getting at there. And this is how we go through our day every day. We walk through the grocery store and we make important decisions about the health and nutrition of our family. And we are convinced that we're right and we haven't a clue. We're not able to do the math between ounces and servings and all of those things on the fly. And we really just don't know what we're doing. So I mention this because our confidence in our answer and whether or not we're correct may or may not be the same thing, because that slow thinking part of our brain doesn't kick in unless it knows it needs to. And if it doesn't know that it needs to, it won't. And so many of the things that we are convinced are true just aren't. We use mental shortcuts to answer these questions because there are just too many decisions to make in a day. I mean, it's inevitable that we have to do it. Otherwise, we'd be overwhelmed. And so a couple more examples. One is confirmation bias. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the idea that we seek out information that's consistent with our beliefs and we discount information that is inconsistent with our beliefs. So I like to give an example of my own bias at work. So let's say that I read an article that said organic food is more nutritious than conventional food. What would I do? I would ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? Perfectly reasonable things to do. But now let's say that the article said organic, no more nutritious than conventional. What would I do? I'd tweet it, right? Because it's consistent with what I believe. I wouldn't ask the questions. I wouldn't dig deeper. I wouldn't probe the authors. And that's what bias looks like. We ask tough questions of things we disagree with. We don't ask those questions of things that we agree with. And it's easy to see bias in other people. It is incredibly difficult to recognize bias in ourselves. And the better we are at identifying our own bias, the better we will be at engaging with others when they have bias as well. Another shortcut is something called the availability heuristic. It's just this idea that what's the thing that comes to mind the easiest? So when I say the word natural, are you thinking butterflies and rainbows and puppies? Or are you thinking salmonella, COVID, Ebola, right? Because those are all natural too. So we know sort of intellectually that bad things in the world are just as natural as many of the good things in the world, and that there are many good things that are man-made, just like there are many bad things that are man-made. But the things that come to mind, and that's of course why the word natural on a product is wildly influential in how people think about it. We're easily swayed by the words that are used, and we need to be aware of this tendency. It's not just something other people do, it's something that we all do. And so in order to be able to convey our information better, whether we're a scientist or a policymaker or a farmer, we all need to become better storytellers. And some of the things that we need to do is we need to personalize those stories. I think this is particularly important for scientists because many times when you go out to speak to audiences, the first thing you do is to dive directly into your research because you're so excited about it. You want to tell people what it is that you do, but you seldom stop to tell people why you do it. Why did you go into the area that you're in? That's why at the beginning of my story, our presentation, I told you a little bit about my upbringing on a farm. Because it's one thing for somebody to say they worked for the US Department of State doing global food policy, It's another to know that they actually have experience producing their own food. It's very different. We need to acknowledge people's concerns. In 13 years working at the US Department of State, I did not meet a single person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government, who didn't trust big businesses, but they all love science. The problem is that when science and our values are at odds with each other, our values always win, because our values tell us who our friends are. And if you have to change your values, you probably have to change your friends as well. And so it's very difficult to get people to opt for the science over their values. And so it's also important to get deeper than the level. So if we were talking about gluten-free or we were talking about GMOs, those are just examples of people's concerns about the health and safety of their family. So the value isn't really focused on gluten or GMOs, it's focused on the health and safety of the family. And that's a value we can all share. So you often want to get lower than whatever the level of the controversy is to understand what is the value behind that controversy. And often you'll find that you share that value. It provides an opportunity to connect with people. And it's only at the time that you've connected that you can build trust. And it's only when you have trust that science has anything to contribute to the conversation. A few years ago, I was speaking to the American Meat Science Association, and there were, I think, 800 meat scientists in the room. It was just as exciting as it sounds. And I told them, if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it. So think about that for a moment. If somebody trusts you and you're talking about something that's controversial, you might say, I have 1,000 research studies that say it's true. Well, if they trust you, they don't need to see that research because your word is good enough. Now let's imagine though that somebody doesn't trust you and you say, I have 1,000 studies that show that it's true. Well, it doesn't matter. They don't want to see your research if they don't trust you, because why would they trust your research any more than they trust you? So you really need to reach that point of trust in the conversation before you can move on and talk about science. We often talk about, sustainable food production, but we need to remember that sustainability is a journey, not a destination. Every farmer in America today is wildly better, more sustainable than any farmer was in 1970. And every farmer in 2050 will be wildly more sustainable than any farmer is today. And so it's a journey. We're never going to get to a place where we've achieved sustainable agriculture. And what's sustainable on one farm isn't going to be the same as what's sustainable on another farm. Reducing water use matters a lot if you're in the American Southwest, but it matters not at all if you're on the Chesapeake where it's all rain-fed. Reducing fertilizer use is really important if you're on the Chesapeake, not so important if you're in the American Southwest. So the steps that can take that make you more sustainable are even different. So what we need to focus on is, are farmers getting better every day? Are they doing things better next year than they did it last year? That's what's important, because the journey, not the destination. So as I'm coming close to my conclusion here, if we went back to 1968, we would have been talking about the book, The Population Bomb. And in this book, it talks about how global population is exploding and that 1 billion people were going to die in the next decade because of lack of food. And it encourages governments like the US to stop sending food aid to these regions and just let the people die. Rather than dragging out their misery, it would be more humane to just let them go. Now, of course, that 1 billion people didn't die, and they didn't die because the Green Revolution was already well underway. And by 1970, Norman Borlaug would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to the Green Revolution. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't negative environmental impacts from the Green Revolution, but saving 1 billion people, I think, goes in the plus column. So how we talk about this matters. And even today, though, many people are worried about that population growth. We talked about going from 7.8 to 9.5 billion people. And that is obviously something that's a challenge, meeting those food needs. But what we seldom talk about is what happens after 2050. Well, in terms of population, the population growth slows dramatically. By some estimates, it will actually be down to 7.5 billion people even by 2100. If we were to meet the Sustainability Development Goals, by some assessments, we'd be back to 7.5 billion people in just 80 years. Remarkable. The point, though, is that what happens if we get to 2050 without screwing up the planet? In other words, what if we achieve our goals? For the first time in human history, future productivity gains will not go to feeding more and more people. They'll go to reducing the footprint of agriculture. That's an opportunity. What people sometimes forget is that the entire 2 billion people we're going to add to the planet over the next 30 years is because of people living longer. 100% of population growth is because of people living longer. And that's of course why population declines so quickly after 2050. It's not like we're going to keep having more and more people and have 20 billion people on the planet, 100 years from now. That's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen. So every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the people on the planet. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the people on the planet. The challenge we have is not to deal with population and the environment forever. The challenge we have is to get to 2050 without screwing up our planet. Because in many ways, if we do, we will be good forever. So the thought I want to leave you with is the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we have to get it right. And that's why the things that you're working on are so critically important. I look forward to questions, and feel free to reach out to me if you have questions that aren't answered during this presentation. With that, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the slides here.
Thanks very much, Jack. Really interesting presentation. I'm going to hand back over to Jess to maybe ask a question or two, and then we can, again, open up for others. And if anyone does have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat, or just write that you have a question. We'll be sure to unmute you. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Uh-oh, I think Jess might have frozen there right when she was getting into her question. Jess,
oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. I was saying, as a person who does research primarily and thinking that, if I publish my papers in journals, that's sufficient enough. And we know that that's not, of course, to convince policymakers and the public on changing behaviors. But, right now, there's a lot of conversation about the food system because we have the UN Food Systems Summit coming up at the end of this year, which is probably for the first time where food is really on the international agenda, every country really working towards this summit. And part of the conversation is around what they're calling game changers. What is going to shift the way we produce and move food around the world and the diets we consume by 2050? And thinking in all your expertise and experience in working on, wearing the many different hats, what do you see as the one or two game changers that would essentially change the way we are producing food now, like you had said, how we do that by 2050? What do you see as one or two really big game changers to make changes in the food system?
Yeah, I think that there are a few. One is if we can shift diets so that countries that are going to be demanding more protein because their incomes are increasing and populations are growing, don't follow exactly the same path of the United States and other Western countries. The second is that alternative proteins and other things that are being developed are able to scale and meet some of that future demand. And that we can reduce food waste so that we don't have the third of food that's lost. A third of food is lost before it reaches a consumer in the developing world. It's lost post-consumer in the developed world. So those are important. But what I worry about in conversations like the UN is that those are game changers to close the gap on what we need to achieve by 2050, but they don't really recognize the contributions of the incumbents. Because we're in what I just told you, there's an emphasis on alternative proteins and other companies. But if you look at what the World Resources Institute has indicated as like their menu for change, how do we get to that sustainable future? 61% of the progress we need to achieve is baked into their analysis based on historical improvements in agriculture. In other words, 2/3 of what we need to get to that sustainable future will be done by the incumbents. Only 1/3 needs to be done by everybody else. And so we're rightfully focused on the game changers to close the gap, but we need to not give credit to those who are doing most of the heavy lifting, because they need to be part of that conversation and not feel like they're excluded. And specifically, I'm thinking, livestock producers and crop producers and others, they're going to do most of that work.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. I'm going to ask Gabriella to maybe ask her question here verbally, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you, Gabriella.
Sure. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Gabriella Petrick. I'm a historian of food systems and dietary change across the 20th century, particularly in the US, but I do some global work as well. And so I have a couple comments that I think it's important for people to start to grapple with. First of all, there's no food system, right? There are systems of systems within systems. And so these are very complicated and they're very interconnected. And so certainly one system affects another. So we got to get out of the mindset of a food system, because what agriculture looks like in sub-Saharan Africa versus Brazil versus the United States and Canada are all fundamentally different, right? So we need to start to unpack that complexity. And when I talk to people in public health and when I talk to people in nutrition and when I talk to policymakers, this stuff gets really, as this talk showed today, when we're talking about food, you're talking about corn and soy, which are commodity products that go into meat systems, most of which aren't eaten by humans. Part of the system, but not food in and of themselves for human consumption, right? But I think it's really important to take a historical look at it, right? And so over the long term, we never can forget that agriculture has the word culture in it, right? And I thought one thing that was really particularly salient in the talk was this idea about values. And so one of the conversations is, how do we get people to change what they eat? The research and my research is it's really hard to get people to change what they eat, because because it is a value. It's about home and hearth and family and perceptions of nutrition. And so thinking about it, not how do we get people to change what they eat, how do we get people to recognize the value of changing what they're doing and not either over reifying slow food, which has its problems, or the lab food, which also has its problems. And how do we actually really confront dietary change from a class, a race, and a gender perspective? And these are things that I don't tend to hear. So that's sort of the commentary, but also raises the questions of then how do you combine these, what I'll call humanities approaches, into policy and science. As a historian of science and technology, I grapple with this, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
So I have a book coming out in May, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. And I do talk about the history of the change in the food system in the United States, and look at it much more from a behavioral standpoint than, sort of the food system itself. We know more about health and nutrition today than we ever have in the history of the planet, and we're more obese. So information alone is not going to solve those problems. And people didn't gain 30 pounds in 3 weeks, so we're not going to lose that weight. And so for me, it has a lot to do with how do we change our foodscape, our entire food environment. And I think that's a longer conversation, and I'm very interested and passionate about it. But I think you're absolutely right. They are for different food systems, but they are all connected. If Europe follows its farm to fork strategy and moves 25% of its food production to organic by 2030, it will produce 8% less food. And the rest of the world will have to deal with providing Europe that extra food. So while Europe is a food system, that food system then has knock-on effects in other places. But I think that many Eat Lancet and other reports are not focused enough on food culture, and telling people what they should do doesn't necessarily help. Telling people what they could do, I think, is more inspiring and could have a difference. So I think the language we use will matter as well. So maybe Gabriella, you and I should have a separate conversation about that. Would love to hear more about your thoughts.
Great, thanks, Jack. We have a couple of more questions queued up here. I'm going to read. I'll read one and then let you respond, and then maybe go to the next. So David Myers is asking, like, he also has close ties, family ties to farming in Kansas, and he's interested in your thoughts. I don't know if you're familiar with, but the efforts like those at Land Institute in Kansas to sequester carbon in agricultural lands. Not sure if you can speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just did this talk for K-State last week. So I think I'm very interested in the opportunity and the possibility of carbon sequestration. One thing I worry a little bit about, though, is that if you went back to the early 2000s, and many in the environmental group were talking about the opportunities of producing ethanol and other biomaterials, and many farmers jumped on board with producing ethanol, and then all of a sudden analysis came out that said, no, it's not really better for the environment. And so they had spent all of this energy transitioning into producing biofuels, and felt like they had the rug pulled out from under them. So I worry a little bit that farmers will eventually buy into this idea of carbon sequestration and will dive completely in on it. And then it will turn out that we're not able to measure the carbon sequestration accurately enough to know if it's really working, or that if somebody then tills the soil 5 years from now, everything's lost. So I think we need to follow it and we need to appreciate it. But I think I'm still hesitant to how it's actually going to work. So a lot of research should go into it. I think we all inherently know that if you don't till, you use low till and no till, it must be better for the farm. But whether or not we're going to be able to quantify that is a separate question.
Thanks. Another question here about democratization of food systems. So Anne is saying that two common heard critiques is that either the private sector has too much power, or governments and elites have too much power in food systems, and that democratization, returning power to people, is one proposal out there. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that. What kind of critique, the nature of that critique.
So, I think we often say science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And so I think in many ways, the public does have the power to impose its will on the food system or food systems. But the question is, does the public understand what changes they need in order to achieve the goals they want? Just to use continue with the UN food system analogy or example, they're very much focused on local food systems. The European farm to fork strategy is all about sort of reducing the impact of agriculture locally. It wants to reduce fertilizer use, insecticide use, and water use, and all those things. And that's how many consumers think about sustainability. If we can produce food with less, that must be good. But that's good for that piece of land. But if we need more pieces of land, then maybe it's bad for the global sustainability. And so, there's really a continuum between local sustainability and global sustainability, and there will always be trade-offs between the two. So while we need consumers to be engaged in the conversation, they absolutely should be, and they should inform themselves, there isn't going to be one answer for all consumers at all times in all places. So if, some consumers that can afford to pay more for their food, that's good. But some consumers, need food that's less expensive. And many of the conversations I hear, I think reflecting the elite perspective, is that food is too cheap. Well, clearly people who are saying food is too cheap are not struggling to buy food. And, it's easy to say, well, we should just take the subsidies from agriculture and move those over to feed people. Well, the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that's a $75 billion program. All of US subsidies to agriculture is only $20 billion. So, that's not going to help anybody with anything. So it's just not enough. It's a $2 trillion industry. So we need to do more to make food more sustainable and do more investment in conservation, all those things. But we all need to be part of that conversation, not one or the other. And we need to recognize that there won't be an answer. There will be lots of answers for different people. And I always tell people my personal mission is to de-escalate the tension in our food system so that we can all get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. And let's focus on what we do and not tell other people how they should do what they do.
This is somewhat related, but Brian in the chat here has a question I think maybe comes from your slide and comment about leading with science and maybe losing people with science. So Brian's asking really, how does one go about building trust with the public while at the same time maintaining transparency and communicating about science and scientific basis for policy?
So part of what I do is I try to share information along that reflects a variety of perspectives and to engage with a variety of actors. So the company I was with, Intraxon, one of the subsidiaries was Transova Genetics, one of the largest livestock genetics companies in the country. But I've also worked with dozens of plant-based food companies, cell-based food companies, dairy industry. And, I like to engage with different perspectives. And so part of it, I think, is if you're seen as being engaging with a variety of people, it may undermine people won't trust you entirely, but they will recognize that you have a range of perspectives to bring to the conversation. And, personally, I'm fine being the only plant-based authority in a conversation about livestock and being the only livestock person in a conversation around cell-based. I don't mind being the outsider. That's not where everybody wants to be, but I think opening yourself up to a variety of perspectives is always helpful.
Thanks. Maybe we have time for one more question here. Alan Goldberg, I've allowed you to speak if you'd like to.
Thank you very much, Jack, for a provocative talk. Having just completed, the book was published in October, working with people from the Berman Institute, called Feeding the World Well. I'm the editor of that book. The issues that come up in terms of how you started your talk with a broken food system is how do we get equity and justice into the workforce in the food industry, which, as you point out, is producing most of the food in this country. And one example, thinking of the meat production, not only are the workers so badly paid, but their health conditions that they work under are atrocious, as pointed out by COVID, and the fact that they try to increase the speed lines of killing, making it more dangerous to work in those speed lines. So how do we deal with this kind of issue in a very profitable market?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one can engage with companies. I think part of it is the person that's trying to engage with them on the issue, do they trust them and do they feel like they have their interests in mind? And so I'll just give you one example. I worked with the cell-based meat companies, which is lab-grown meat. And until 2017, they were calling it clean meat. And they called it clean meat because they felt like it was going to be safer and it was like clean energy and it was better for the environment and all of those things. But it was also highly offensive to livestock producers. And their view was, well, we don't really care because livestock producers are less than 1% of consumers anyway. And so I spent a year working with those companies to get them to change the language they use. So they don't use the term clean meat anymore. And I did it though because I thought it was in their self-interest. 28 states tried to ban the use of the term meat for their product. So the language they were using was creating these pushbacks that was keeping them from bringing their own products to market, even though there was not even a single product on the market yet. So I didn't try to convince them that it was the right moral thing to do not to offend people. I convinced them that it was in the best economic sense for their industry to stop using that language. And so today, the Good Food Institute, has a policy of not adopting language that is offensive to certain groups. And so, they've completely changed their perspective about what is appropriate to use based on their own interest. And I think if I was trying to work with, the Cargills and the Tysons of the world, it would be to try to help them understand where their long-term goals and interests are versus the short-term economic interests. And I think, that can happen. And, transparency and publicity are things that companies don't like. So you need a little bit of push and pull. And so it's not a conversation we're going to resolve right here, but, I do think that there are ways of engaging with those organizations that, they will see as in their own interest.
I agree with you. Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll thank you again, Jack, for joining us for today's seminar. It's really a pleasure. And we'll welcome everybody else to join for our next seminar, which is on March 8th. And it's on ethical issues involving scientific research with psychedelics with Roland Griffiths. So a very different topic, but should be interesting as well. So thanks again, Jack, and take care of you.
Sure.